Hello there, U.S. History students, and welcome to the second lecture of Unit 2, Reconstruction. In the first lecture, our focus was primarily on all the challenges and difficulties Reconstruction presented the country and how Presidents Lincoln and Johnson attempted to solve these problems and bring the South back into the Union as quickly as possible. Today, we're going to jump right into the idea of how life for African Americans changed after the Civil War and the Southern response to these changes. First and foremost, we must deal with the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. It was passed in December of 1865, and every Southern state was required to ratify it in order to be readmitted to the Union. This had long been a goal of the radical Republicans. Even leading into the Civil War, they were all about humanitarian rights and equality. Unfortunately, this would not guarantee African Americans equality, as the Southern states would try to find ways in order to prevent that from occurring. But overall, it is seen as a very significant amendment and the first of the Reconstruction amendments. President Lincoln and President Johnson did not believe that the government should aid the newly freed slaves. However, Congress was not in agreement, and in 1865, they passed the Freedmen's Bureau over Andrew Johnson's veto. The purpose of this organization was to aid the newly freed slaves in their transition from slavery to freedom. It was moderately successful. It provided food, clothing, medicine, education to ex-slaves and poor whites. Probably its greatest achievement was in the area of education, where it taught over 200,000 ex-slaves to read and write, eventually leading to the development of primary and secondary schools and the first two African American colleges, Fisk and Howard universities. The Freedmen's Bureau also negotiated labor agreements between freedmen and planters, working out some arrangements for some work to be done.
I won't run, I won't fly, I will never make it by without you, without you.
One of the major goals of the Freedmen's Bureau was to provide land for the newly freed slaves. They had decided that every slave would be given 40 acres and a mule of land that had been confiscated from slave owners, plantation owners, during the Civil War. This was one of the biggest disappointments of the Freedmen's Bureau because very little of this land actually ever ended up in the hands of former slaves. One of the major reasons was President Andrew Johnson vetoed this bill, this part of it, and they were not able to override it. And so he, Johnson, ended up giving all the land back to former slave owners. And this was disappointing because land ownership would be the key to freedom. That would be what would really allow African Americans to become equal or more equal to other Americans. The Freedmen's Bureau expired in 1870 and was not renewed because of all the disagreement in Congress, but it was successful to a great extent and did aid many African Americans in this transitionary period. This is a photo of one of the schools where an African American woman here is teaching the young children to read and write. And it gave them opportunities. It allowed them to be on a more level playing field with other Americans. Another photo, the reason why I have this one up here, as you can see, the teacher here is a white woman. And this was extremely dangerous, as you'll see here in a little bit. There was a lot of opposition to educating the former slaves because the white Southerners, racist white Southerners, realized that once they became educated, the former slaves, that would put them more in terms of equality and opportunity, more opportunities for the African Americans. Well, the South was not really all that willing to accept all the changes that the North wanted to institute at the end of the Civil War. The Southerners were going to be defiant in many areas, as you will see. First of all, in terms of politically, they just resorted back to the way things had been. Okay. Former Confederate leaders were elected to high offices. The former Confederate States of America Vice President Alexander Stephens was elected to the United States Senate from Georgia. Basically, 100% of the governments in the South, these provisional governments, were again 100% all white, usually all white, racist, upper class Southerners. So not much, if anything, had changed to the governments prior to the Civil War. And this upset members of Congress, radical Republicans, mightily. But it was not going to be easy for them to change. It's not like they lost the Civil War and then they were going to change all their beliefs and who they were. This will become very evident. And so what the Southern states attempted to do to kind of fight against the 13th Amendment and other amendments that would come was they passed what were called the Black Codes. And the Black Codes were simply laws that were meant to maintain superiority over the African Americans. And the major goal was white Southerners, rich white Southerners, were very worried about where they were going to get workers from after the slaves had been taken. They relied on slaves for their entire economic system. Who was going to go out and pick cotton and do all the work in the field? So one of the major goals of the Black Codes was to ensure the subservient labor force. And so some of the aspects, some of the components, was freedom was recognized to some extent, but there were many restrictions. They were not allowed, they could marry, but they were not allowed to hold office, serve on a jury, own land, or vote. They could be punished for idleness. It was basically a way for the white Southerners to maintain control over the African Americans. So in terms of equality, this took much of the freedom away from African Americans. Now this is an excerpt of the Black Code of Mississippi. And a couple things that I want to point out here. It talks about free Negroes and mulattoes. If they're vagrant, if they're not working, if they're over 18 years old, they can be fined or imprisoned. But it also talks about whites. If whites are helping them, or if whites are, if there's any interracial relationships going on, the punishment down here for the whites is more severe than it is for the African Americans. This is a letter that was written by an African American teacher of one of the new schools, and it just goes to show you how much opposition that there was. It says in here that she'd been shot at twice trying to teach the children of the school. Some of my night schoolers have been shot, but none killed. A week ago, an aged freedman was shot badly as to break his arm and leg just across the way. So again, the South was defiant that they were not willing to accept this attempt by Congress to gain equality for the African Americans. It's not like after the Civil War, the race relationships became all that much better and everybody lived in harmony. That was definitely not the case. Here is a post office. It says no nigger, Negro allowed in this building, no apes allowed. The racism and discrimination continued, and it would continue on for the next 100 years. This basically is a stepping stone towards segregation, which we'll talk about in an upcoming unit. Finally, members of the South began to form, the KKK and other groups to maintain white superiority. And the goal of the KKK was to resist laws protecting African Americans and white supporters. And they used all kinds of methods of intimidation, burning houses, schools. You all have seen the pictures of them with their sheets over their heads and so forth. In Louisiana, in 1868, 1,081 blacks and white Republicans were killed. Lynchings that have people hanging from trees and beatings, just as a way to intimidate those, not only African Americans, but those working for African American equality. They despised the white people that supported black rights just as much as they despised African Americans themselves. And the KKK is still going today. In 40 states, there are organizations of the KKK, and it is known that there are well over 250,000 members of the KKK today. So it just didn't come to an end. It wasn't just for a certain time period. It continues. It's not as bad as it has been, but there are still areas in racism and discrimination that need to be addressed. So in review of today's lecture, the African Americans were given some rights with government help, but the Southerners did everything they possibly could to prevent the African Americans from achieving these rights. And so in the next lecture, Lecture 3, we will analyze what Congress did to begin to enforce these rights. Eventually they got fed up enough with the South and the South's attempt to keep things the way they always had been, that they had to take some drastic actions.